She stepped off the stagecoach clutching a folded marriage contract, just as the men on the porch went quiet. And when no one came to claim her, she started walking toward the one man they all warned her about. But why didn't he come? The dust hadn't settled when Irene tightened her grip on the paper and passed the last storefront, boots sinking into the rutted road. Behind her, voices followed, low, certain, like they already knew how this would end. Ahead, the land stretched bare, and on the rise stood a lone house with no smoke in the chimney. She didn't slow, didn't turn back. Somewhere beyond that door was a man who had agreed to take her in, and a silence no one in town dared explain. Would you have stopped, or kept walking toward him anyway? The stagecoach rolled into Ashridge under a sky bleached pale by the summer sun. Dust rose in slow clouds behind the wheels, drifting over the storefronts and hitching posts like a curtain no one bothered to pull back. It came to a stop in front of the general store. No one hurried forward. A few men leaned against the railing outside the saloon. A woman paused mid-step with a basket of bread. Someone shifted a chair just enough to get a better look. The door opened. Irene Cole stepped down carefully, one hand braced on the frame. Her dress had once been a soft brown, now dulled by miles of road and red dirt. The hem carried the weight of the journey. In her other hand, she held a worn canvas bag, the handle darkened where her fingers had pressed it too long. She didn't look around right away. Her boots touched the ground. She steadied herself. Then she lifted her head. The street stretched out ahead. Low wooden buildings, a smithy with its door open, the faint clang of metal still echoing inside. Wind dragged loose paper along the dirt. Somewhere a screen door creaked. No one greeted her, but they were all watching. She's the one, a man muttered, not quietly enough. Came for Hale, another said, voice low, almost thoughtful. Irene adjusted her grip on the bag. She didn't turn toward them. She had heard worse in places that didn't even bother lowering their voices. A boy no older than 12 stood by the hitching rail, holding the reins of a tired mule. He squinted at her, then jerked his chin toward the open land beyond the town. You're looking for Gideon Hale, he said. Ain't here. I know, Irene replied. Her voice was even, not soft, not sharp, just steady. The boy hesitated, then pointed past the last row of buildings. Road goes that way, up past the dry creek. You'll see his place before you miss it. She nodded once. That was all. Behind her, the stagecoach driver had already turned away, busy with the horses. No one offered to carry her bag. No one asked if she needed a room. They didn't have to. Everyone in Ashridge already knew why she had come. Irene reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded paper. The edges were worn thin. She opened it just enough to see the line she had read too many times to need again. Stay. Work. No questions. She folded it back carefully and slipped it inside. A gust of wind lifted dust across her boots. She looked down for a moment, then brushed it off with the side of her hand. The motion was small, practiced. Then she started walking. The town didn't follow her, but it didn't let her go either. Eyes stayed on her back as she passed the last building, the last fence post, the last scrap of shade. Out beyond Ashridge, the land opened wide. Dry grass bent under the wind. A line of hills cut the horizon. The road was little more than a pair of ruts pressed into hard earth, leading toward a stretch of land that looked empty until you noticed the shape of something set back against the rise. A house, if you could call it that from a distance. Irene walked without stopping. Her steps were measured, not hurried. The bag pulled at her shoulder, but she didn't shift it. Sweat gathered at her collar, slid down her spine. The sun pressed down, steady and patient. Halfway up the rise, she paused. Not to rest, just to look. The house stood alone, built of rough timber, the boards weathered to a gray that matched the sky on a bad day. A fence line ran crooked along one side, patched in places, leaning in others. A small barn sat off to the left, door half open, shadowed inside. No smoke from the chimney, no movement, no sign of anyone waiting. Irene took a breath, slow and deep, then let it out. Behind her, Ashridge had already begun to shrink, its noise swallowed by distance. Ahead, there was nothing but that house, and the man who had not come to meet her. She climbed the last stretch. The yard was hard-packed dirt. A broken bucket lay near the well. A length of rope hung loose over the fence post, frayed at the end. She stepped onto the porch. The wood gave a low creak under her weight. The door was closed. For a moment she stood there, hand hovering near the handle. The wind moved through the dry grass behind her, carrying the faint sound of something shifting in the barn. She turned her head slightly. A figure stepped out of the shadow, tall, broad-shouldered. He didn't rush, didn't call out. He just walked forward, boots steady against the dirt, stopping a few paces from the steps. Gideon Hale. Up close, he looked even larger than the town had made him out to be. Not exaggerated. Just a man built from years of work. His shirt sleeves were rolled, forearms marked by old cuts and sun. His face was still, eyes fixed on her, not hard, not welcoming. Just there. He took in the bag, the dust, the paper she still held in her hand. "You made it," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Irene lowered her hand. "I did." A pause settled between them. Not awkward, just unfilled. He nodded once, as if that confirmed something for him. "Water's in the well," he said. "Food's inside. Room's yours." He turned slightly, already stepping back. Irene watched him. "You're not going to ask me anything?" she said. He stopped. For a second, the wind was the only thing moving. Then he shook his head. "No." Nothing more. He walked past her, heading toward the barn, leaving the space between them empty again. Irene stood on the porch, the door still closed behind her. She looked down at the handle. Then, slowly, she reached for it and pushed it open. The house inside was clean in the way of something used, not lived in. A table, 2 chairs, a stove with a pot set off to the side. No decoration, no softness, just what was needed. She stepped in, setting her bag down near the wall. For a long moment, she didn't move. Outside, the sound of Gideon's boots faded into the barn. A horse shifted. Wood creaked. Irene walked to the window. From there, she could see the fence line, the open land, and beyond it, the faint outline of Ashridge in the distance. She rested her hand on the sill. Then she looked back at the room. At the table. At the empty chair across from it. And finally, at the door Gideon had disappeared through. The paper in her satchel pressed faintly against the side of her bag. Stay. Work. No questions. Irene exhaled slowly. "All right," she said under her breath. No one answered, but she didn't need them to. She moved to the stove, lifted the lid, checked what was there. Then she rolled up her sleeves. The house was quiet, but it was no longer untouched. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the smell of something warm had settled into the room. Not much, just beans, salt, and a bit of dried meat softened in water. Still, it carried through the boards, into corners that hadn't held a scent in a long while. Irene moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but because she was taking measure of the place. Every step had a purpose. Every drawer she opened, every shelf she touched, told her something. The plates were stacked in pairs, not more. The cups didn't match. One chipped, one clean. The knife on the table had been sharpened recently, but the handle was worn smooth from years of use. Nothing extra, nothing kept for comfort. She set a tin cup near the edge of the table and poured coffee from the pot she'd found tucked behind the stove. Grounds were cheap, burned a little on the tongue, but it was hot. Outside, Boots crossed the yard. Gideon didn't come in right away. She heard him at the well first. The rope creaked, water sloshed into a bucket, then silence again. When the door finally opened, it did so without hurry. He stepped inside, ducking slightly under the frame, though he didn't need to. His eyes moved once across the room. The stove, the table, the cup she'd set out. He didn't comment. He closed the door behind him, wiped his hands on a rag hanging by the wall, and walked to the table, sat down without asking. Irene stood by the stove, one hand resting lightly against the edge. "Food's ready," she said. He nodded. That was all. They ate without speaking. The scrape of spoon against tin carried louder than it should have. The wind pressed against the walls, finding its way through small gaps in the boards. At one point, Gideon paused. Not long, just enough to look at the cup she'd placed near him. He picked it up, took a drink, then set it back down in the same spot. No thanks. No comment. But he didn't push it away either. When he finished, he stood, carried his plate to the basin, rinsed it with a careful motion that suggested habit more than thought. "I'll be in the barn," he said. Irene turned slightly. "You don't sleep inside?" He didn't look at her. Not needed. Another pause. Then he stepped out, the door closing behind him with a soft, final sound. The quiet returned, but it felt different now. Irene moved through the room again, slower this time. She folded the cloth she had used to wipe the table, set it neatly by the sink, checked the latch on the window, everything in its place. Except one thing. The back wall. She had noticed it earlier, not because it stood out, but because it didn't match. The grain of the wood ran different, slightly darker, a seam too straight to be natural. She stepped closer, ran her fingers along the edge. A door. Locked. No handle on the outside. Just a small metal loop set low, meant for a key she didn't see anywhere nearby. She didn't try to open it, not yet. Instead, she stepped back and turned toward the floor. There, near the far corner, just beside the leg of the table, one board sat a shade lighter than the rest. Not loose, just placed. Irene crouched, pressed her fingers against it. It didn't move at first. Then, with a slight shift, it gave just enough for her to slide it aside. Underneath, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a thin piece of wood, no bigger than her forearm. She pulled it out carefully. It had been sanded smooth on one side, the other still rough, edges unfinished. Along the surface, faint pencil lines curved in a shape she didn't recognize right away. Not a box, not a tool. Something smaller. Something meant to hold. Irene turned it slightly, letting the light from the window catch the grain. Then she set it back, wrapped it again, placed the board over it exactly as she had found it. No reason to disturb what wasn't hers. Outside, the sky had turned a deep blue, the last light clinging to the edge of the hills. From the barn, she could hear the low sound of a horse shifting, followed by the steady rhythm of something being moved. Wood, maybe, or tools set down with care. Gideon was still working. Irene walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air had cooled, carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain that hadn't reached them yet. She rested her hand against the railing. From here, she could see the fence line stretching out across the land. Some posts stood straight. Others leaned. A few had been patched recently, fresh wood standing out against the old. Work that never finished. Work that never waited. She looked toward the barn. The door was open just enough to spill a thin line of lamplight onto the ground. For a moment, she thought about walking down there, asking him about the door, the board, the piece of wood hidden beneath the floor. But she didn't. Instead, she turned back inside, closed the door. The house held its quiet again, but now it carried something else too. A question, and the shape of something that had been started, but never finished. The next morning came early. Light slipped through the window before the air had warmed. Irene was already up, sleeves rolled, a kettle set low over the stove. She stepped outside with a tin pail and crossed to the well. The rope was still damp from the night before. She hauled the bucket up steady, braced her foot against the base as she poured water into the pail. Behind her, boots hit the ground. Gideon had come out of the barn. Same shirt, same quiet. He paused when he saw her at the well. Not long, just enough to take in the scene. Then he walked past, heading toward the fence line. No greeting. But as he passed, he slowed. "The east side," he said, not turning. "Fence is weak there." Irene straightened slightly. "I'll take a look." He nodded once, then kept walking. That was the closest thing to a conversation they'd had. She carried the pail back inside, set it by the sink, then reached for her gloves. Old, worn at the fingertips, but still holding. The land didn't wait, and neither did she. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to burn the dew off the grass. Irene stood at the eastern fence, hands on the top rail, testing the weight. He hadn't been wrong. The post shifted under pressure. Wire sagged between the stakes, loose enough that a strong push could send it down. She stepped over the lower rail and into the field, bent down, picked up a length of spare wire left coiled near the base. She didn't look back at the house, didn't look for Gideon. She just set to work. By the time the wind picked up again, carrying dust across the open land, her hands were already moving in rhythm with the task. Not waiting, not asking, just doing what needed to be done. And somewhere behind her, though she didn't turn to see it, Gideon had stopped working long enough to watch. Only for a moment. Then he went back to his own side of the fence, but the distance between them had shifted. Not gone, just smaller than it had been the day before. The sky turned heavy by late afternoon, a dull gray settling over the valley. The wind came in low, pushing against the grass in long waves. By the time Irene stepped back from the fence line, her hands were raw, her sleeves streaked with dirt, and the air carried that sharp, metallic scent that meant rain was close. She glanced toward the house. Gideon was already moving along the far side of the field, checking the posts one by one. He didn't call out, didn't look her way. But his pace had changed, faster now, like he was working against something. The first drop hit the dust and disappeared, then another. Within minutes, the sky opened. Rain fell hard and sudden, turning the ground slick underfoot. The eastern fence, the one Irene had been working on, sagged again under the weight of the wind. A low, restless sound rolled across the field. The cattle. Irene turned. One of the posts gave way with a crack, the wire snapping loose enough for a gap to open. A steer pushed forward, testing it. Then another. She didn't think. She dropped the coil of wire and ran. "Might hold," she muttered under her breath, grabbing the loose end, trying to pull it tight against the leaning post. Mud sucked at her boots, nearly pulling one free as she braced her weight. The wind pushed harder. Another animal pressed against the opening. The wire slipped from her grip. Irene lunged forward, planting herself between the gap and the shifting line of cattle, arms out, voice low but firm. "Back. Come on. Back now." The animals hesitated, confused more than threatened. Rain streamed down her face, soaking her dress, blurring her sight. Her foot slid. Just enough. The ground gave way beneath her, and she dropped hard to one knee, the impact knocking the breath from her chest. A hoof struck the mud inches from her hand. Then another. The sound of movement behind her came fast. Boots, heavy, sure. A hand closed around her arm, strong, unyielding. Gideon. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her up, steadying her against him as he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the broken fence. His other hand grabbed the loose wire, yanking it back into place with a force that held. The cattle shifted again. He didn't raise his voice, just a sharp, low command. One word. Enough. The animals backed off, slowly, reluctantly, but they moved. Gideon held the wire until Irene found her footing again. Then he released her just as quickly as he had grabbed her, turning his focus back to the fence. "Post won't hold," she said, breath still uneven. He nodded once. "Get the brace," he replied. She didn't ask where. She ran, back to the pile near the shed, grabbed a length of wood already cut to size, the ends notched clean. When she returned, he was already knee-deep in the mud, digging the base of the post deeper with the heel of his boot. She handed him the brace. Their hands brushed, just for a second. Neither of them pulled away too fast. He set the wood into place, driving it down with the hammer from his belt. Each strike rang dull under the rain, but steady. Irene held the post upright while he worked. When it was done, the fence stood again. Not perfect, but strong enough. The rain slowed as quickly as it had come. For a moment, they both stayed there, hands still on the same piece of wood, the air between them filled with the sound of water dripping off the wire. Then Gideon stepped back. He looked at her. Really looked this time. Rain had soaked her through. Mud streaked her skirt. Her hands were shaking, though she tried to steady them against her sides. "You shouldn't have come out alone," he said. It wasn't harsh, just plain. Irene met his gaze. "You were already working the other side," she answered. Another pause. Something in his expression shifted. Not enough to name. Just enough to notice. He bent, picked up the coil of wire she had dropped, and handed it to her. "You held them," he said. Not praise, just fact. Irene nodded slightly. "So did you." They stood there a second longer than needed. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, like always. But slower this time. That evening, the house felt different again. Not warmer. Not yet. But less empty. Irene changed into a dry dress, wrung out the one she had worn, and hung it near the stove. The fire took a while to catch, the wood damp from the storm, but she coaxed it steady. By the time Gideon came in, the room carried heat. He set his hat by the door, water still dripping from the brim, and paused just inside. His eyes moved across the room. The fire, the table, the extra cloth she had laid out to dry. He walked in, slower than usual, sat. This time he didn't wait for her to speak. "Fence will hold," he said. Irene nodded, setting a plate in front of him. "For now." He looked at the food, then at her. A moment passed. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, rough, like they hadn't been used in a long time. Irene didn't answer right away. She just sat across from him, hands folded lightly in her lap. Then, after a second, she gave a small nod. "You're welcome." They ate, still mostly in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Not empty, just shared. Later that night, When the fire burned low and the house settled into its usual quiet, Irene moved across the floor, checking the latch on the window again. Her eyes drifted to the corner, to the board beneath the table. She hesitated, then knelt, lifted it again. The cloth was still there, the piece of wood untouched. This time she studied it longer, ran her fingers along the curved lines. It wasn't just a shape. It was part of something. A frame, carefully measured, carefully cut. Not for a box, not for a tool, for something meant to be held, gently. Irene wrapped it back up, placed it where it had been. But she didn't cover it right away. Instead, she looked toward the back wall, at the locked door. The seam in the wood caught the last light from the fire. She stood slowly, walked to it, stopped just short. Her hand lifted slightly, then fell back to her side. Not yet. She turned away. The house creaked softly as the wind shifted outside. From the loft above the barn, she could faintly hear movement. Gideon settling in for the night, alone, like always. Irene moved to the table, sat down, and rested her hands flat against the wood. The rain had passed. The fence still stood, and somewhere between the storm and the quiet that followed, something had changed. Not spoken, not promised. But there, waiting. The days that followed the storm settled into a rhythm that felt almost steady. The ground dried under a wide, open sky. The fence held. The cattle stayed where they belonged. Nothing urgent pressed at the edges. But the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. Irene noticed it in small things. The way Gideon left a stack of split wood just inside the door before dawn. The way a loose hinge she had meant to fix was already tightened by the time she reached for it. The way he paused now, sometimes, when she spoke, just long enough to hear her through. Still, he kept his distance. Still, the door at the back of the house stayed locked. Late one afternoon, a cloud of dust rose along the road leading up from Ashridge. Irene saw it first from the porch. A rider. No, two. They came slow, like men who didn't need to hurry. Gideon was already out by the fence line. He didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood there, waiting. The horses stopped in the yard. The man in front swung down first. Clean coat. Boots polished enough to catch the light. He brushed dust from his sleeve like it offended him. Barrett Crowley. Even Irene knew the name. The second man stayed mounted, watching. Crowley walked forward with the ease of someone used to being listened to. "Well now," he said, glancing at Irene, then back to Gideon. "Didn't expect to find you settled in so proper." Gideon didn't answer. Crowley smiled, thin and brief, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded set of papers. "Figured I'd save you a trip into town," he said. "This here concerns your land, or what you think is yours." He handed the papers over. Gideon took them, didn't unfold them right away. "You can read," Crowley added, almost kindly. "Or I can have it read to you. Makes no difference to the outcome." Irene stepped off the porch. "Let me see," she said. Crowley's eyes shifted to her, measured, curious. "And you are?" "I live here." That was all she offered. Crowley studied her a second longer, then gave a small nod. "Well then," he said, "you might want to know what you're standing on." Gideon passed the papers to her. Irene unfolded them carefully. The print was tight, legal, filed through the county office. She scanned the lines, her brow tightening just slightly. Claim of improper boundary, transfer of rights under dispute, notice of intent to seize. Her eyes moved slower the second time through. Something didn't sit right. "This line here," she said, tapping the page lightly. "The boundary reference. It doesn't match the survey from the ridge. Crowley tilted his head. Survey's been updated. By who? County clerk. Irene looked up. No clerk signs off without a witness. This doesn't have one. The second man on the horse shifted slightly. Crowley's smile faded just a touch. You're sharp, he said, but it won't change much. It might, Irene replied. Silence stretched between them. Gideon hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his eyes were on the paper now, on her hand where it rested against it. Crowley stepped back. You've got time, he said. Few days. Then I come back with men who won't bother talking. He turned, mounted his horse in one clean motion, and pulled the reins. Wouldn't drag this out, he added. Land don't favor those who hesitate. They rode off the way they came. The dust settled slowly behind them. Irene folded the papers again. They're wrong, she said. Gideon nodded once. They always are. She looked at him. You've seen this before? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the barn, like the conversation had ended. Irene stood there a moment longer, the paper still in her hand. Then she followed him. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and leather. Light cut through the slats in thin beams, catching dust in the air. Gideon stood near the workbench, hands braced against the wood. You're not going to fight it? She asked. He shook his head slightly. No use. There's always use. They'll take it. Not if the claim doesn't hold. He looked at her then, something heavier behind his eyes now. It will, he said. Because it's true? She pressed. He didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It felt closed. Irene let it sit. Then she turned, back to the house. The sun had already started to dip by the time she reached the door. The air cooled, carrying the first hint of night. Inside, the room felt tighter somehow. She set the papers on the table, looked at them, then at the back wall, the locked door. Her jaw tightened slightly. She crossed the room, no hesitation this time. She checked the latch again, still firm, still closed. Her eyes moved lower, to the seam, to the place where the boards met just slightly off. She stepped back, looked around, then reached for the small iron poker by the stove, slid it carefully into the gap, pushed. Once, twice. The wood shifted. Just enough. The latch inside gave a dull, quiet click. The door opened, slowly. The room beyond was small, bare, but not empty. A frame stood against the far wall, half-built, wood curved in a shape she recognized now. A bed, small, carefully measured. Beside it, folded and worn, lay a child's shirt. Irene stepped inside. The air felt different here. Still, untouched. She reached out, brushing her fingers along the smooth edge of the frame. It matched the piece she had found beneath the floor. Same grain. Same careful lines. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Gideon stood in the doorway. He didn't move forward, didn't reach for the door. He just stood there. His hands at his sides, fingers curled tight enough to pale. You shouldn't be in there, he said. His voice was low, not angry, just held back. Irene didn't step away. You were building this, she said. He didn't answer. For who? Silence. She looked at the shirt, then back at him. Someone behind them shifted outside. A voice, distant but clear enough, carried from the yard. Told you he let him drown. Irene froze. Gideon didn't turn. The voice came again, from farther off this time, drifting on the wind. Man like that don't deserve land. The words hung there, heavy. Irene looked at him. at the way his shoulders had gone still, at the way his jaw tightened, not in anger, but something quieter, deeper. "You didn't kill anyone," she said. He shook his head, slow. "No." "Then what happened?" For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, finally, "I didn't move fast enough." The words came rough, like they had been sitting there too long. "Water took him," he added. No more than that, but it was enough. Irene looked back at the bed frame, at the careful work, the unfinished edges. She understood now. Not all of it, but enough. She stepped back, out of the room, past him. She didn't say anything else, didn't press. Behind her, the door stayed open, for the first time since she had arrived, and the quiet that followed was no longer empty. Morning came slower than usual. The light crept through the window and settled across the table, touching the folded papers Irene had left there the night before. The claim, the signatures, the lines that didn't quite hold together when you looked at them twice. She was already awake. Coffee sat on the stove, low heat, just enough to keep it warm. She stood by the table, sleeves rolled, one finger tracing the edge of the document again, not reading, just remembering. Behind her, the door opened. Gideon stepped in, boots still damp from the early grass. He didn't go to the table, didn't reach for the papers, just stood there for a second, like he was waiting for something to pass. It didn't. Irene poured a cup, set it down across from her. "You're going into town," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. Then, "No." She nodded once, like she had expected that. "Then I am." That got his attention. He looked at her fully now. "They'll be waiting," he said. "I know. They won't listen. They will if I give them a reason." A pause. The wind pushed softly against the side of the house. The same sound as always. But now it seemed to carry something else with it. A kind of pressure. Gideon stepped closer to the table. "You don't have to do this," he said. Irene met his gaze. "I didn't come here to stand still." Another pause. His hand moved slightly. Not toward her, toward the paper. Then stopped. "I won't go with you, son," he said. "I'm not asking you to." She folded the document, neat and exact, and slipped it into her bag. "I'll be back before dark," she added. Gideon didn't nod, didn't agree. But he didn't stop her either. Ashridge looked the same from a distance, but closer, the weight of it felt different. The same men sat outside the saloon. The same chairs creaked under their weight. The same dust lifted when a wagon passed through. Only now, they watched her walk in like they had been expecting it. Irene stepped up onto the boardwalk without slowing. Inside the general store, the air smelled of flour and leather. The clerk looked up, hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Morning." "Morning?" She placed the papers on the counter. "I need to see the county records. Last survey filed on Hale land." The clerk glanced at the door, then back at her. "Those ain't usually—" "I know what they usually are." Her voice didn't rise, didn't press, just stayed where it was. The clerk hesitated again, then reached under the counter and pulled out a ledger. "Don't take long," he muttered. Irene flipped through the pages carefully. Dates, signatures, lines drawn across maps that didn't quite match the land she had walked herself. Then she found it. The original boundary. Signed. Witnessed. Not the same as the one in her bag. She closed the ledger slowly. "Thank you." Outside, voices had gathered. Barrett Crowley stood near the hitching post, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn, like he had nowhere else to be. "You learned something?" he called out. Irene stepped down from the boardwalk. I did. And? She walked closer, close enough that the others leaned in without realizing. You filed a claim that doesn't match the recorded survey, she said. No witness, no proper transfer. Crowley smiled. Paper's paper. Not when it's wrong. A few men shifted. The air tightened. Crowley stepped forward now. You think that changes what happens next? Irene held his gaze. I think it gives the judge a reason to look twice. Silence. Not loud, but it spread. Crowley's smile thinned. You going to drag him into town for that? He asked. Make him stand up there and explain himself? Irene didn't answer, because she didn't know, not yet. By the time she rode back, the sun had dipped low enough to stretch the shadows long across the field. The house stood the same. Still. Quiet. But the barn door was open. She stepped down, tied the reins, and walked toward it. Gideon was inside, working at the bench, the frame, the small bed. He had added another piece, fitted it into place with slow, careful hands. He didn't look up when she entered. You find what you needed? He asked. I did. She set the papers down beside him. He didn't reach for them. Your land holds, she said, if you stand there and say it. The hammer in his hand stopped. For a long moment, he didn't move. I told you, he said quietly. They'll take it anyway. Not if you speak. He let out a breath, low, rough. I don't. He stopped, tried again. I don't stand in front of people. Irene looked at him. Not the size of him, not the strength, just the man holding a piece of wood like it mattered more than anything else. You stood in front of that fence, she said, in the rain. That's different. No, it isn't. He shook his head, didn't argue, but didn't agree. Silence stretched again. Then Irene stepped closer, not touching, just near enough. You didn't let the water take everything, she said. You're still here. His grip tightened on the wood. That ain't the same. It is if you decide it is. Another pause, longer this time. Then, slowly, Gideon set the hammer down. His hand stayed on the frame, on the unfinished edge. If I go, he said, it doesn't change what happened. No, Irene replied, but it changes what happens next. He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time since she had come to that house, he didn't look away. The next morning, the road back to Ashridge felt shorter. The town didn't look different, but the way people stood did. The small courthouse sat at the far end, white paint worn thin by sun and years. Inside it was cooler, quieter. A few men leaned along the wall. Crowley stood near the front, waiting. Gideon stepped in behind Irene. The room shifted. Not loudly. Just enough. The judge looked up. You here on the Hale matter? Irene nodded. Yes, sir. And he's here to speak? A pause. Irene didn't answer. She didn't need to. Gideon stepped forward. One step, then another. His voice, when it came, was low, but steady. The land's mine, he said. Been worked, been held. Survey says the same. Crowley opened his mouth. But Gideon didn't stop. I didn't lose it then, he added. And I ain't losing it now. Silence. No long speech. No explanation. Just truth. The kind that didn't bend. The judge looked down at the papers, then at Irene's, then back at Gideon. We'll review it, he said. That was all, but it was enough. By evening, the house felt different again. Irene moved through the room, setting things back in place. The door at the back stayed open. The small frame sat where it had been moved, closer now, not hidden. She ran her hand along the edge once, then stepped back. A letter sat on the table, folded, addressed. She had written it that afternoon. Simple words. Come when you can, there's room. Gideon stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. He didn't say anything, just looked at the room, at the fire, at the table, at her. Irene rested her hand on the small frame. House is big enough, she said quietly. No question in it. Gideon didn't answer, not with words. He crossed the room slow, set his hat down. Then, instead of turning toward the door again, he walked past it, toward the space that had always been left empty. That night, the barn stayed quiet, and for the first time since Irene Cole stepped off that stagecoach, Gideon Hale did not sleep alone. Out beyond the house, the land stayed the same. The fence still needed tending. The wind still came through the valley without asking. Nothing about the world had softened for them. But inside, something had shifted. Not in words, not in promises. In the quiet way a chair is pulled closer to the table, or a door left open when it used to stay shut. Irene had come to that place with nothing but a paper and a choice. Gideon had spent years believing one moment of hesitation had cost him the right to hold anything at all. Yet somehow, between a storm, a broken fence, and a truth neither of them tried to dress up, they found something that didn't ask them to forget the past, only to stand in it and keep going. Maybe that's what a home is after all. Not a place without pain, but a place where someone stays, even after they see it. So if you were standing where Irene stood, would you have walked away or stepped inside and taken the chance anyway? And if this story stayed with you for a moment, there are more like it waiting. Quiet ones, rough-edged, honest in their own way. You're always welcome to come back and sit a while longer.